Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks was walking through a quiet park in Jacksonville with his 8-year-old daughter when she suddenly stopped. Lying beside the path was an old German shepherd, painfully thin, exhausted, and barely able to lift his head. Sophie knelt in her bright yellow dress and whispered,
"Daddy, we can't leave him here."
Daniel hesitated until he saw the worn metal tag on the dog's collar. K9 Maverick, JPD. This was no stray. Maverick had once been a decorated police canine, but somehow he had ended up alone and forgotten. Saving him would uncover the heartbreaking story of the handler he lost, and lead to one final act of courage that would change a grieving Marine, his little girl, and Maverick forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and subscribe if you believe every loyal dog deserves one more chance at home. Late spring sunlight stretched across Wilson Bay Park, turning the water beyond the trees into a sheet of pale gold. Families moved lazily along the walking paths, children chased one another beneath the oaks, and somewhere beyond the park, the distant roads of Jacksonville carried Marines home from another day at Camp Lejeune. Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks should have felt relieved. Instead, his phone felt heavier than the ribbons pinned to his uniform. Daniel was 37, 6 feet tall and broad through the shoulders, with the compact strength of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the United States Marine Corps. His dark brown hair was clipped close to his scalp, regulation neat, and a faint line beside his left eyebrow gave his otherwise disciplined face a permanently serious look. He was the sort of Marine younger men trusted during difficult days because Daniel rarely raised his voice and almost never showed fear. At home, however, confidence had become harder. His wife, Rachel Brooks, had died unexpectedly while Daniel was overseas. Rachel had been warm, patient, and effortlessly social, the kind of woman who remembered neighbors' birthdays and could make a quiet room feel alive simply by entering it. Losing her had changed both Daniel and their daughter. Daniel had returned to North Carolina carrying the belief that he should have been there. No amount of duty, medals, or explanations had completely silenced that thought. His phone vibrated again. He looked at the email for the third time. Deployment consideration, 8-month assignment. It was not an order yet, not even an official selection, but Daniel knew what opportunities like this could mean for his career. He also knew what 8 months meant to his daughter. "Daddy!" Daniel immediately locked the screen. 20 feet ahead of him stood 8-year-old Sophie Brooks. Sophie was small for her age, with light brown hair gathered into a high ponytail and large hazel eyes that seemed capable of noticing every emotion Daniel tried to hide. Before Rachel's death, Sophie had been endlessly talkative, curious about strangers, birds, clouds, anything that crossed her path. Now she chose her moments more carefully. She still laughed, she still loved people, but there was a hesitation inside her that had not been there before. That afternoon she wore a bright yellow summer dress with small ruffled sleeves. Rachel had bought it several months before her death, insisting yellow made Sophie look like sunshine. Sophie had nearly outgrown it. She refused to give it up. "You said no work today," she reminded him. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket. "You're right. That was work. That was me making the mistake of looking at work." Sophie studied him for another second. Then she turned and continued down the path. Daniel sighed quietly and followed. He had promised her this afternoon. No base, no paperwork, no conversations about the future, just the two of them. For several minutes, things almost felt normal. Sophie walked along the edge of the paved trail, balancing carefully as though an invisible line ran beneath her shoes. She stopped to examine tiny flowers beside a bench, then hurried forward again. Daniel stayed several steps behind. Then Sophie stopped so suddenly that Daniel nearly called her name. She was staring at something in the middle of the path. "Daddy?" The brightness had disappeared from her voice. Daniel moved quickly. At first, he thought someone had dropped a dark blanket across the pavement. Then the shape lifted its head slightly. A German shepherd. The dog was large, or at least Daniel could tell it had once been large, and powerful. Its black and tan coat looked dull from weeks outdoors, and its body had become painfully lean. Age showed around its muzzle in streaks of gray. A worn brown leather collar rested loosely around its neck. The German Shepherd did not bark. It did not approach. It simply watched them. Daniel's training took over before his emotions could. "Sophie, behind me!" He stepped between his daughter and the dog. The shepherd's ears rose. Something changed instantly. Its exhausted eyes fixed on Daniel's Marine uniform. Its head lifted another inch, but instead of becoming aggressive, the dog seemed to tighten inward. Its shoulders stiffened and its ears remained alert, as though the sight of a uniform had awakened an old memory. Daniel noticed. So did Sophie. "Why did he do that?" "I don't know." "Is he scared?" "Maybe." Daniel studied the dog carefully. There was no collar identification visible from where he stood. No owner was calling from the trees. No leash rested nearby. Sophie stepped sideways. Daniel reached back and gently caught her wrist. "Not yet." She looked up at him. "He looks tired." "I know." "He needs water." "Sophie, I won't touch him." That stopped Daniel. She slowly removed the small bottle from her backpack. Then she crouched several feet away. The German Shepherd watched every movement, not randomly, precisely. His eyes followed her hand to the bottle, then shifted toward Daniel, then returned to Sophie. Daniel's expression changed. He had been around enough military working dogs to recognize discipline when he saw it. Even exhausted, this dog was reading the room. Sophie poured some water into a small paper snack bowl she had carried from lunch and placed it on the pavement. The dog did not move. She waited. "It's okay," Sophie said quietly. Daniel looked at her. There was something familiar in the gentleness of her voice. Rachel used to speak that way to frightened children at neighborhood gatherings, never demanding, never rushing, simply giving them enough time to feel safe. Sophie pushed the bowl forward with both hands. The shepherd's nose twitched. Slowly he raised his head, then his chest. His front legs trembled slightly beneath him, but he managed to shift upright. Sophie smiled. "There you go." Daniel stayed ready, but the dog made no sudden movement. Instead, it lowered its head toward the water. Only then did Daniel notice the front leg. A pale band of worn fur circled part of it, subtle but unmistakable. "That's strange," Sophie whispered. "What?" "His leg." Daniel had seen similar marks before. Equipment, a working harness, something worn repeatedly over many years. He crouched a little closer. The shepherd looked directly at him. Those eyes were tired but not empty. Daniel felt an unexpected tension settle in his chest. This animal had been trained. He was almost certain now. Daniel slowly extended one hand, stopping well short of the dog's face. "No rush, buddy." The German Shepherd's ears shifted. For 1 second, Daniel thought the dog might recognize the tone more than the words. Sophie remained beside him in her yellow dress, quiet and patient. Daniel waited. Eventually, the shepherd lowered his head again, permission or something close enough to it. Daniel moved carefully toward the collar. The leather was old and softened from years of wear. Beneath the dog's thick neck fur, his fingertips found something cold. Metal. A tag. He turned it over. The letters were faded and scratched, but still readable. Daniel stared. K9 Maverick, JPD. His breathing changed. Sophie noticed immediately. "What does it say?" Daniel did not answer at first. He looked at the dog again, the posture, the attention, the faded harness mark, the reaction to his uniform. It suddenly made sense. "Maverick," Daniel said softly. The dog's right ear moved. Sophie leaned closer. "That's his name?" Daniel nodded. "And there's something else." He held the tag between his fingers. K9. Sophie knew enough from growing up around military and police families to understand. Her eyes widened. "He was a police dog?" "Looks that way." Daniel pulled out his phone, but this time Sophie didn't complain. He called a local veterinary clinic and explained what they had found. The clinic could examine Maverick, but no animal transport vehicle was immediately available. Daniel looked from the phone to the dog, then toward his SUV in the parking lot. "All right," he said. "We'll bring him ourselves." Sophie looked almost relieved. Daniel removed his uniform jacket first and folded it loosely around Maverick's body to give himself a secure hold without frightening him. "Stay near me, Soph." "I will." He slid one arm carefully beneath Maverick's chest and another beneath his hindquarters. The dog was lighter than Daniel expected, far lighter. That realization hurt more than he anticipated. But Maverick did not resist. For a brief moment, his head rested against Daniel's shoulder. A Marine carrying a retired police dog across a quiet park, while a little girl in a yellow dress walked beside them. Daniel had no idea yet how those three lives had come to meet on that particular afternoon. He only knew he could not leave Maverick where they had found him. When they reached the SUV, Daniel gently settled the German Shepherd across the back seat. Sophie stood beside the open door. Maverick's eyes were nearly closed. "Daddy?" "Yeah?" "We're coming with him, right?" Daniel looked at his daughter. Something in her expression brought Rachel back to him for a painful, fleeting second. "We're coming with him." Sophie smiled. Daniel began to close the door. At the last moment, Maverick lifted his head, weakly, slowly. His eyes found Sophie and remained there. The yellow of her dress reflected faintly in the SUV window. Then his head lowered again. Daniel looked once more at the worn metal tag hanging from the old collar. K9 Maverick, JPD. This was not a stray dog who had simply wandered into their path. Somewhere, Maverick had a story, and Daniel had the sudden feeling that finding him was only the beginning. The lights of Coastal Carolina Veterinary Center glowed against the deepening blue of the Jacksonville evening. By the time Daniel carried Maverick through the glass doors, the last warmth of the afternoon had faded, and Sophie's yellow dress seemed almost too bright for the sterile waiting room. A woman in navy scrubs hurried from behind the reception desk before Daniel could explain much. Dr. Emily Foster was 34, slender and medium height, with auburn hair twisted into a practical knot and calm green eyes that seemed trained to notice details before emotions. She had worked emergency veterinary medicine for almost a decade, and years of seeing frightened animals arrive with equally frightened families had made her gentle without making her sentimental. She spoke quietly, moved carefully, and never rushed a nervous animal simply because people around her were in a hurry. "Set him here," she said, guiding Daniel toward a padded examination table. "Easy. Let him decide how much he can tolerate." Daniel lowered Maverick onto the blanket. The German Shepherd remained unusually still, his eyes moving between Emily, Daniel, and Sophie. Emily noticed immediately. "He watches people closely." "I noticed that in the park," Daniel said. "The tag says K9. Emily glanced at the worn metal plate hanging from Maverick's collar. "That changes a few things." Sophie stood beside the table, hands clasped in front of her yellow dress. "Is he going to be okay?" Emily crouched so she was closer to Sophie's height. "He's very tired, and he hasn't had enough food or water for some time, but I'm not seeing anything right now that makes me think we're too late." Sophie released a breath she had been holding. Emily spent the next 20 minutes examining Maverick without forcing him. He was severely dehydrated and underweight, and his paws suggested he had traveled far over rough ground. But there was no major injury. His heart sounded steady. His temperature was lower than Emily wanted, but manageable. "He's probably been outside for several weeks," she said, "maybe longer." Daniel looked at the dog's narrow frame. How does a police canine disappear for weeks without someone looking for him? That's what I'd like to know. Emily reached for a handheld scanner. "Let's see if the collar tells us only part of the story." She passed the scanner slowly over Maverick's shoulders. A beep sounded. Sophie brightened. "What was that?" "Microchip." Emily read the number twice, then walked to the computer at the corner of the room. Daniel rested one hand on the edge of the examination table while Sophie stayed near Maverick's head. "Hi, Maverick," she whispered. "At least now we know your name." His right ear shifted. Sophie smiled instantly. "You heard me." Daniel saw it too. Not excitement, not yet, but recognition. Emily became still at the computer. That's interesting. Daniel looked over. What? She turned the monitor slightly. The registration was old but valid. Maverick, Jacksonville Police Department, K9 unit. Below it appeared another name. Handler, Officer Cole Harrison. Emily looked at Daniel. You were right. He wasn't just trained, he was active law enforcement. Daniel took out his phone and called the non-emergency line. After several transfers and a short explanation that sounded increasingly unbelievable each time he repeated it, he was given a number for the K9 unit. Less than 40 minutes later, a police SUV pulled into the clinic parking lot. Sergeant Luis Ramirez entered, wearing a dark blue Jacksonville Police Department uniform beneath a lightweight jacket. He was 45, stocky and powerfully built, with close-cropped black hair graying at the temples and a thick mustache that made his serious expression look even more severe. Ramirez had spent 18 years with the department, 11 of them around working dogs. He had the direct manner of a man who disliked wasted words, but those who knew him understood that his sternness had sharpened after losing several officers and canine partners over the years. Around dogs, his voice always softened. Daniel met him in the hallway. You're Staff Sergeant Brooks? Yes. Where is he? Daniel pointed through the open examination room door. Ramirez stopped. For several seconds, he said nothing. Maverick lay beneath a warming blanket while Sophie sat in a chair beside him reading the back cover of a children's book she had pulled from her backpack. Ramirez's face changed completely. No way. He stepped inside. Mav? Maverick's eyes opened, his ears lifted. Ramirez approached slowly, stopping several feet away. It's Luis, buddy. Maverick raised his head. Not much, but enough. Ramirez covered his mouth briefly with one hand and looked toward the ceiling before collecting himself. We thought he was gone. Daniel folded his arms. Gone how? Ramirez pulled a chair over. Maverick worked our unit for 6 years. Search operations, missing persons, tracking. One of the most reliable dogs we ever had. He removed his phone, scrolled through old photographs, and stopped at one. Daniel took it. The photograph had been taken at a department recognition ceremony. Maverick looked almost unrecognizable. Broad-chested, alert, coat shining, standing proudly beside a uniformed police officer. Officer Cole Harrison looked about Daniel's age, perhaps 36 or 37. He was tall and lean, with sandy brown hair, a square jaw, and an easy smile that seemed almost out of place beside the formal uniform. Ramirez explained that Cole had been patient by nature, the kind of officer who could spend an hour earning a frightened child's trust without ever acting inconvenienced. He had joined the K9 unit because he believed dogs exposed the truth in people: impatience, fear, kindness, arrogance. Maverick and Cole had been together long enough that officers joked neither needed to finish a command before the other understood. Daniel stared at the photograph. Cole could have stood beside him at Camp Lejeune and looked perfectly ordinary. Same generation, same tired confidence around the eyes. What happened to him? Daniel asked. Ramirez looked at Maverick before answering. Cole died almost 2 years ago. Traffic accident coming home after duty. Sophie stopped reading. Ramirez kept his description simple. Maverick wasn't with him, but after Cole was gone, the dog changed. How? Sophie asked. Ramirez turned toward her. He still listened, still knew every command, but he stopped caring about the work the same way. We tried pairing him with another handler. Maverick would do what was asked, then go sit by Cole's old locker. Sophie looked toward the German Shepherd. He was waiting. Ramirez nodded once. That's what it felt like. After Cole's death, Maverick had been retired rather than forced through another full working partnership. A relative of Cole's agreed to take him temporarily. For a while, the arrangement seemed stable. Then that family moved. Maverick was placed with a private boarding and retirement facility outside the county, one that handled older working dogs and long-term placements. A few months earlier, the facility had collapsed financially. They were transferring animals to different rescues and homes, Ramirez explained. Records got messy. During one of those transfers, Maverick disappeared. No one searched? Daniel asked. We did. There was defensiveness in Ramirez's answer, but more sadness than anger. Shelters were notified. Animal control had his chip number. We checked roads, farms, online reports, nothing. Weeks became months. Daniel looked at Maverick. Somehow the old K9 had traveled all the way back toward Jacksonville. Back toward the city where he had worked. Back toward the place where Cole had lived. Emily returned with fluids and a feeding plan. He's stable tonight, she told them, but rebuilding him physically is the easy part compared with rebuilding trust. Ramirez nodded. That sounds like him. Emily looked at Sophie. Quiet visits may actually help. Familiar voices, predictable routines, no crowding him. Sophie took that instruction seriously. Beginning the next afternoon, Daniel brought her to the clinic after school. She never rushed Maverick. She sat near his kennel and read. On Monday, it was a story about a boy who built a boat. Tuesday, a book about stars. Wednesday, she read the same chapter twice because she decided Maverick had fallen asleep during the first attempt. The clinic staff noticed something before Sophie did. Maverick rarely lifted his head when strangers passed, but when Sophie's shoes appeared in the hallway, his ears moved. Then his eyes opened. Then, by the fourth day, his head rose before she even entered the room. Emily leaned against the doorway watching. He knows your footsteps. Sophie smiled. I knew he was listening. At school that week, Sophie's third-grade teacher, Mrs. Hannah Kendall, announced their next class presentation. Mrs. Kendall was a cheerful woman in her early 40s, short with curly dark hair and brightly colored glasses. She had taught Sophie since before Rachel died and had become especially careful not to treat the girl as fragile afterward. She believed children recovered confidence by being given meaningful things to do, not by being protected from every difficult emotion. The assignment was called Someone Who Makes Me Brave. Each student had to choose a person who helped them feel stronger and explain why. That afternoon, Sophie placed the worksheet beside Maverick's kennel. I don't know who I'm picking yet, she told him. Maverick watched her quietly. Daniel was standing outside the room when his phone rang. He stepped into the hallway. Brooks? His company commander, Major Ethan Walker, was calling from Camp Lejeune. Walker was a disciplined 43-year-old career Marine with a shaved head, steady voice, and a reputation for giving difficult news without dressing it up. We got movement on that assignment, Walker said. 8-month deployment. You're on the short list. Daniel glanced through the glass at Sophie. And? You take it and perform well, it puts you in a strong position for the next promotion board. Daniel lowered his voice. When do they need an answer? Soon. Inside the room, Sophie turned a page. Daniel stepped farther down the hallway. I'll think about it. He did not realize Sophie had come to the doorway looking for him. She only heard 2 words. 8 months? Daniel turned. Sophie was standing there. For a moment, neither spoke. Who's going away for 8 months? She asked. Daniel locked his phone. No one's going anywhere right now. It was technically true, but Sophie knew her father well enough to recognize the tone he used when the truth was larger than the answer. She returned to Maverick without arguing. That hurt Daniel more than if she had. Later, as the clinic settled into evening quiet, Sophie sat beside the German Shepherd and traced one finger along the edge of her school worksheet. Ramirez's story was still in her mind. Cole gone. Maverick passed from place to place, then lost entirely. She looked toward Daniel. If he lost his person... Daniel waited. Sophie glanced back at Maverick. Then who's his person now? Daniel opened his mouth. No answer came. Maverick lifted his head and looked at Sophie, and for the first time, Daniel wondered whether that question was really only about the dog. 3 days after Maverick was cleared to leave the veterinary center, the Brooks house changed. Not dramatically, at first. There were no joyful leaps through the doorway, no instant bond, no miraculous transformation. Maverick entered the small two-story home in Jacksonville as if he were stepping into a place that did not yet belong to him. His paws moved carefully across the hardwood floor, his head low, his amber eyes studying every doorway, every window, every unfamiliar corner. No foster family experienced with retired working dogs had become available, and the local shelters were already crowded. Dr. Emily Foster believed Maverick would recover better somewhere quiet than in another kennel. After several calls between the clinic, Jacksonville Police Department, and the rescue coordinator, Daniel agreed to a 30-day foster placement. 30 days, he had told Sophie. She had nodded with suspicious enthusiasm. Daniel knew that look. It meant she had already stopped thinking of 30 days as temporary. Sophie had prepared everything before Maverick arrived. A thick orthopedic dog bed sat beside the living room couch. 2 stainless steel bowls rested on a rubber mat in the kitchen. She had even placed 3 toys beside the bed, a rope, a rubber ball, and a stuffed blue bear she had declared too babyish for herself 6 months earlier. Maverick ignored all of them. That first night he chose the floor beside the front door. Sophie carried his blanket over. He moved 3 feet away. She brought the blanket again. He moved back to the door. Daniel watched from the stairs, hiding a smile. "Soph, I'm making him comfortable. I think he's telling you where comfortable is." Sophie frowned at Maverick. "The floor is not comfortable." Maverick lowered his head onto his paws. "He disagrees." She finally surrendered, but before going upstairs she returned with a small yellow scarf that had once belonged to Rachel. Sophie had kept it in a drawer because it still carried, at least in her imagination, the faintest trace of her mother's perfume. She folded it near Maverick's chosen sleeping place. "This stays," she told him. Maverick did not touch it while she was watching. By morning, the scarf was tucked beneath one of his front paws. The first week remained uneven. Maverick ate more consistently, and his strength slowly returned, but certain sounds seemed to pull him backward. One evening, a police drama played quietly on television while Daniel folded laundry. A burst of radio chatter came from the speakers. Maverick rose so quickly that the blanket slid from beneath him. His body became rigid. Daniel immediately muted the television. For several seconds, Maverick stared toward the sound that was no longer there. "It's okay," Sophie said from the table. Daniel raised one hand gently. "Give him space." Sophie understood. She did not approach. That became her method. Every evening, she sat on the living room floor with her homework several feet away from Maverick. On Monday, she worked beside the couch. On Tuesday, she moved closer to the rug. By Thursday, she was within arm's reach. She never tried to force a touch. Sometimes she read spelling words aloud. Sometimes she complained about fractions. Sometimes she told Maverick things Daniel suspected she had not told anyone else. "I don't like when people say I'm brave," she said one evening. "Sometimes I'm just pretending not to be scared." Maverick lay with his head down. His ear moved toward her voice. Daniel stood unnoticed in the hallway. For the first time since Rachel's death, Sophie had begun speaking about fear as something she could carry instead of something that controlled her. At 5 every morning, before Jacksonville fully woke, Daniel began walking Maverick. The streets were cool and blue under the early sky, sprinklers ticking across lawns while distant traffic began moving toward Camp Lejeune. Daniel wore running clothes instead of his uniform, and Maverick walked beside him without pulling. The dog rarely needed correction. Daniel would slow, Maverick slowed. Daniel would change direction. Maverick noticed before the leash tightened. "You really did this a long time, didn't you?" Daniel murmured one morning. Maverick glanced up. There was something familiar in the rhythm between them. 2 creatures who had spent years learning routines, commands, vigilance, and discipline, and now were expected to understand what came after. Daniel began to realize that Maverick watched bodies more than voices. A shift of weight, a turn of shoulders, a hand reaching toward a door. Often those movements told him enough. At home, however, one thing still unsettled him: Daniel's uniform. The first morning Daniel came downstairs dressed for duty, Maverick rose from beside the door. He stared. Not frightened, exactly, but intensely. Daniel stopped halfway across the room. The gold insignia, dark uniform fabric, polished boots, something about it carried meaning. Maverick's ears went forward. His breathing changed slightly. Daniel lowered himself onto one knee. "I'm not Cole." The words escaped before he meant to say them. Maverick stayed where he was. Daniel wondered whether dogs understood absence differently than people did. Humans used calendars, photographs, funerals, anniversaries. A dog simply learned that footsteps no longer returned. He stood again. "Take care of her." Maverick's eyes followed him to the door. By the second week, the neighborhood had noticed. A large German shepherd appearing behind the Brooks fence attracted attention, especially among parents whose children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. At first, some crossed to the opposite side. Daniel understood. Maverick was still thin but clearly powerful, and people saw the shape of a working dog before they saw the exhaustion that had once lived behind his eyes. Then Maverick began changing their minds without trying. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie sat on the front lawn drawing with sidewalk chalk while Maverick rested beside the porch steps. Two neighborhood children approached cautiously. "Does he bite?" one asked. Sophie looked offended on Maverick's behalf. "He mostly sleeps." Daniel, washing his SUV nearby, added, "Ask before you touch him." The younger child held out a hand from a safe distance. Maverick remained still. Eventually, he leaned forward and sniffed. 10 minutes later, both children sat beside Sophie while Maverick lay quietly among them, like an old guard who had decided the assignment required very little effort. Sophie laughed when someone accidentally drew a blue chalk line across her shoe. Daniel looked up. The sound stopped him. It was not the polite little laugh Sophie had learned to give adults who tried too hard to cheer her up. It was the laugh she used to have. Rachel's favorite sound. Later that afternoon, Sophie mentioned her mother without becoming quiet afterward. Mom would have bought Maverick one of those ridiculous Christmas sweaters. Daniel smiled. She absolutely would have. With antlers. Definitely antlers. Sophie giggled. Neither of them looked away from the memory. That was new. At school, another change was happening. Sophie had begun spending recess with Noah Parker, a 7-year-old boy from a neighboring classroom who often sat alone near the edge of the playground. Noah was short and slight, with straight blonde hair that always fell across his forehead and gray eyes that rarely stayed on another person for long. He had a gentle nature, but became overwhelmed easily in loud groups, and because he spoke less than the other children, he was frequently forgotten rather than deliberately excluded. Sophie understood being treated differently. So she sat beside him. Within a week, Noah began walking home with Sophie and Daniel twice a week because his mother worked late nearby. The first time Noah saw Maverick, he froze at the gate. "No," Daniel stopped. "You don't have to come in." Noah stared at the German shepherd. "I'm scared of big dogs." Maverick stood 20 feet away. He looked at Noah once. Then he lay down. That was all. He did not approach. He did not pull toward him. He simply waited. Sophie sat beside Maverick instead of calling Noah closer. "You can stay there." For nearly 10 minutes, Noah remained beside Daniel. Then he took one step into the yard. The following visit, he took 3. By the 4th, Noah sat on the porch while Maverick rested below him. "You think he knows I'm scared?" Noah asked. Sophie nodded. "I think that's why he doesn't come closer." Noah considered this. "That's nice." Daniel heard the exchange from inside the house. Perhaps Maverick's greatest skill had never been following commands. Perhaps it was knowing when not to. That evening, Sophie fell asleep on the living room rug. Her math worksheet remained open beside her, pencil still in her hand. Daniel came downstairs after finishing paperwork and stopped at the bottom step. Maverick was lying directly behind Sophie. His back faced hers, his head faced the room. He had positioned himself between the sleeping girl and every entrance into the living room. Daniel stood there for a long time, something shifted inside him. Until then, he had thought of Maverick as an animal they were helping recover, a responsibility, a temporary guest. But the dog on the rug did not look temporary. He looked like he belonged exactly where he was. Daniel quietly carried Sophie upstairs. When he returned, Maverick had not moved. "Good night, partner," Daniel whispered. The word surprised him. A few days later, another envelope arrived from Camp Lejeune. Daniel opened it at the kitchen table after Sophie had left for school. Deployment confirmation paperwork. 8 months. Promotion consideration attached. He read it twice, then folded it and left it beside a stack of mail, intending to move it before Sophie returned. He forgot. That afternoon, Sophie came home searching for a permission slip. She found the military form instead. Daniel entered the kitchen just as she reached the line containing the deployment duration. Her face had gone still. "What is this?" Daniel stopped. "Sophie, you said no one was going anywhere." "I said nothing had been decided. 8 months is decided enough to put on paper." "It's an opportunity, Soph. I haven't signed it." "But you were going to tell me when?" Daniel struggled for the right answer. That pause became the wrong one. "You always do this," Sophie said. "That's not fair. You always say it's your job. My job is why we have this house. It's part of who I am. And what about being here?" Her voice cracked. Maverick rose from the doorway but did not approach either of them. Daniel lowered his tone. "I am here." Sophie's eyes filled. "You weren't when Mom needed you." The words landed between them. Sophie immediately looked as if she wished she could pull them back. Daniel went completely still. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Sophie whispered, "I don't want to lose another person." She turned and walked toward the living room. Maverick watched her pass. Then he looked at Daniel. He waited only a moment before following Sophie. Daniel remained alone in the kitchen, the unsigned deployment form lying beneath his hand. In the next room, he heard Sophie sit down on the floor. A few seconds later came the quiet sound of Maverick settling beside her. The house had begun to breathe again, but Daniel was starting to understand that healing did not mean the old wounds disappeared. Sometimes it simply meant you finally had enough courage to stop pretending they were not there. The morning after Daniel and Sophie's argument, the Brooks house carried a different kind of silence. It was not the hollow silence that had followed Rachel's death, nor the uncertain quiet of Maverick's first nights beside the front door. This one felt unfinished, as though father and daughter had said the painful part but had not yet discovered what came after it. Sophie ate breakfast without mentioning the deployment papers. Daniel did not bring them up either. Maverick lay between the kitchen and living room, watching both of them with the patient attention of an animal who understood tension without needing to understand words. By late morning, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. The woman who stepped out was Claire Harrison, Officer Cole Harrison's older sister. Claire was 42, tall and slender, with shoulder-length chestnut hair streaked naturally with gray near the temples, and the same clear blue eyes Daniel remembered from Cole's photograph. She dressed simply in dark jeans, walking shoes, and a cream-colored cardigan despite the warm North Carolina day. There was something restrained about her movements, the habit of someone who had spent years learning not to let emotion arrive before she was ready for it. A serious illness, several years earlier, had changed the way Claire lived. Before it, she had been an energetic event coordinator in Raleigh who traveled constantly and filled every weekend with plans. After months of treatment and recovery, she had become quieter, more deliberate, and far less certain that tomorrow could be postponed. Daniel met her at the gate. "Claire Harrison?" She nodded. "Sergeant Ramirez gave me your number. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Her attention moved past him. Maverick had been lying beneath the shade of the porch. Now he was standing. Claire stopped breathing for a second. "Oh, Mav." The German shepherd did not run to her. He did not bark or wag wildly. He simply stared. His ears rose. His body became still in a way Daniel had learned was not fear but recognition. Claire slowly extended one hand. I know, she whispered. It's been a long time. Maverick crossed the yard, one step, then another. When he reached her, he lowered his head and rested it in her open palm. Claire's composure disappeared. She bent over him, one hand covering her mouth while the other remained against his gray-flecked muzzle. Tears slipped down her face without embarrassment. You remember me? Maverick stood quietly beneath her hand. Sophie had come onto the porch without Daniel noticing. She remained beside the railing, watching. That's Cole's sister? She asked softly. Daniel nodded. Claire looked up and wiped her cheeks. You must be Sophie. Sophie came down the steps. I read to him at the clinic. Claire smiled through her tears. Then I owe you more than you know. They spent the next hour beneath the porch awning while Maverick rested near Claire's feet. She had brought photographs, some printed, some stored on her phone. In one, Cole Harrison wore faded jeans and a Jacksonville PD t-shirt while Maverick sat beside a fishing dock. In another, Maverick was sprawled upside down across Cole's couch with all four legs in the air. Sophie laughed. He slept like that? Whenever he thought nobody important was watching. Daniel studied the photographs. The professional K9 from Ramirez's award ceremony slowly disappeared, replaced by something more personal. Maverick riding in the passenger seat on days off, sleeping beneath Cole's kitchen table, sitting beside him on a porch almost exactly like this one. Cole never married, Claire explained. He dated, he tried, but his schedule was terrible, and once Maverick came along, that dog became his whole routine. She glanced down. My brother called him his roommate, his partner, and his worst financial decision. Sophie smiled. But really? Claire's expression softened. Really, Maverick was his family. Daniel understood that sentence more than he wanted to. Claire told them that Maverick had always been unusual around children. On duty, he was focused and serious. Around adults, he did not know. He could be reserved. But when children were nearby, especially nervous ones, Cole said Maverick seemed to make himself smaller. He would lie down before they came close, Claire said. Cole used to say Maverick knew children shouldn't have to prove they were brave. Sophie looked at the shepherd. That sounded exactly like what he had done with Noah. Claire continued. Cole had this plan for retirement. He wanted to take Maverick into schools around military communities. He knew how many kids around here have moms or dads deployed. He thought maybe an old police dog could help them talk about missing someone. Daniel's gaze moved toward Sophie. She was running her fingers lightly along Maverick's shoulder. For several seconds, Daniel could hear only the breeze moving through the trees. The coincidence felt almost too precise. A retired K9 whose handler had dreamed of helping military children had somehow been found in a Jacksonville park by the daughter of a Marine who might soon leave again. Claire seemed to read part of the thought on Daniel's face. He looks different here, she said. Healthier? That too. She shook her head. I mean settled. Her voice became quieter. I wanted to take him after Cole died. Daniel looked at her. Claire folded her hands together. I couldn't. She explained that only weeks before Cole's death, she had begun treatment for a serious illness. Her energy disappeared. Some days she needed help simply getting to appointments. A large working dog with specialized needs had been more responsibility than she could safely manage. So one of our cousins took him, she said. I told myself it was temporary. Then they moved, and Maverick went to that retirement facility. Everyone kept saying he was being taken care of. She stared toward the yard. I believed them because I needed to. Sophie moved closer. You didn't make him get lost. Claire looked at her. No. Then you came when you found out he was here. Claire's eyes filled again. You sound a lot like my brother. That afternoon, Sergeant Luis Ramirez stopped by on his way home from the department. He had heard Claire was visiting and brought an idea he had been discussing with several officers. A K9 memorial walk at Wilson Bay Park. The event could honor retired and deceased working dogs while raising money for medical care and retirement placements. "We've got officers willing to volunteer," Ramirez said. "The department can probably provide old photographs for a memorial display." Sophie sat upright. "Can Cole and Maverick have one?" Ramirez looked toward Claire. Claire nodded. "I think Cole would like that." "Then absolutely," Ramirez said. Noah arrived later with his mother dropping him at the gate before an evening shift. When he saw Claire, he retreated automatically toward Sophie, but his eyes kept returning to Maverick. He had been coming to the Brooks house regularly now, and could stand within a few feet of the shepherd without freezing. That evening, Noah carried a small dog biscuit in his palm. "Do I just give it to him?" Daniel stayed nearby. "You can place it on the ground if that feels better." Noah considered this, then shook his head. He held his hand out. Maverick did not rush him. The shepherd stepped forward slowly and took the biscuit with remarkable gentleness. Noah stared at his empty palm, then smiled. "I did it." "You did," Sophie said proudly. Claire watched from the porch. "Cole would have loved this." Sophie suddenly remembered the school worksheet still tucked into her backpack. "Someone who makes me brave." She had been carrying it for days, without writing a name. That evening she finally did. Maverick. Before Claire left for Raleigh, she opened the trunk of her car and removed a small wooden box. The walnut surface was worn at the corners, and a brass clasp held the lid shut. "This belonged with Maverick," she told Sophie. "I think Cole would want it here." Inside lay an old K9 lead, carefully coiled. Beside it rested Maverick's retirement badge and several photographs. Beneath those was a folded page protected inside a clear sleeve. Claire handed it to Daniel. "Cole wrote that for Maverick's retirement file." Daniel unfolded it. Most of the page contained ordinary instructions, feeding routines, veterinary information, habits Cole had noticed over the years. Near the bottom was a handwritten paragraph. Daniel read silently, then again. Sophie looked up. "What does it say?" Daniel hesitated before reading the final line aloud. "If the day ever comes when Maverick can't work anymore, don't give him another handler just because that's what he knows. He's given enough of himself to the job. He doesn't need another handler. He needs a family." No one spoke. Maverick rested beside Sophie's chair, the yellow scarf beneath one paw. Daniel looked at him and understood why the words struck so deeply. For years, Daniel had measured himself through duty, assignments, promotions, deployments, being useful. Perhaps Cole had learned something Daniel was only beginning to understand. Service could become identity so completely that a person forgot there was supposed to be a life waiting beyond it. The following Monday, Daniel met with Master Sergeant Rebecca Hayes at Camp Lejeune. Rebecca was 46, athletic, silver blonde hair cut just above her collar, with a composed expression and a practical manner sharpened by 24 years in the Marine Corps. She had spent much of her career advising Marines through transitions, family crises, and career decisions. A divorce early in her service had taught her that professional success could not automatically repair what constant absence damaged at home, and she rarely gave career advice without asking what the uniform was costing outside the gate. Daniel explained the 8-month opportunity. Rebecca listened. "There is another position opening," she said. "Combat training instructor, Camp Lejeune." Daniel leaned back. "Permanent?" "For the assignment period. You'd still work long days. It's still the Marine Corps, but you'd sleep in your own house most nights." "And promotion?" "Slower path." Daniel smiled faintly. "Of course." Rebecca did not smile. "You asked for options, not miracles." He looked through the window toward the training field. For once, Daniel did not immediately know which sacrifice duty required, so he made no decision. That same week, Dr. Foster examined Maverick again. The shepherd had gained significant weight. His coat had regained its shine, and his energy was returning steadily. "He's close to where I want him," Emily said. "Physically, he's doing remarkably well." Sophie wrapped both arms loosely around Maverick's neck. "I told you." Emily smiled. "The rest takes time." Daniel looked at Maverick. Time. Perhaps that was exactly what all of them needed. 2 days later, while Sophie was at school, Daniel returned to the veterinary center alone. A rescue coordinator placed several documents on the desk. 30-day foster evaluation, veterinary clearance, permanent adoption agreement. Daniel read every page. Then he reached the final line. Adopter, Daniel Brooks. He signed. When the coordinator asked whether Sophie knew, Daniel shook his head. Not yet. He folded the completed copy and slipped it into his jacket. That afternoon, Sophie came home and found Maverick waiting at the door with the yellow scarf beneath his front paw. She knelt beside him. Daniel watched from the kitchen, one hand resting over the adoption papers hidden inside his jacket. For the first time since Maverick had entered their lives, Daniel knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever happened with his own future, Maverick's wandering was over. He was home. A few weeks later, Wilson Bay Park looked nothing like the place where Daniel and Sophie had first found Maverick lying exhausted beside the path. Summer had settled over Jacksonville, filling the trees with deep green leaves and turning the creek beyond the walking trail into a ribbon of reflected sunlight. White tents stood across the central lawn. Jacksonville Police Department vehicles were parked near the entrance, and photographs of retired working dogs lined a temporary memorial wall beneath a banner for the first K9 Memorial Walk. Maverick had changed almost as much as the park. His black and tan coat had grown thick and clean, the hollow spaces along his sides had filled out, and the strength had returned to his shoulders. Gray still touched his muzzle, reminding everyone that he was an older dog, but he no longer carried himself like an animal trying to disappear. Daniel had replaced the worn leather collar with a sturdy new one. Sophie, however, had insisted that the old scratched identification tag remain attached. K9 Maverick, JPD. He earned that, she had said. That morning, Sophie wore the yellow dress Rachel had bought her. It was becoming a little short at the knees, but Sophie refused Daniel's suggestion that she choose something newer. This is the dress I met him in. Daniel had understood immediately. Claire Harrison had driven down from Raleigh and stood beside the memorial display arranging photographs of Cole and Maverick. Sergeant Luis Ramirez moved between groups of officers, greeting retired handlers and explaining that money raised that day would help older canines with veterinary care and retirement placement. Dr. Emily Foster had volunteered at a small animal health table where she answered questions about caring for aging working dogs. Noah Parker stayed close to Sophie. Only a month earlier, he had been afraid to walk through the Brooks family gate if Maverick was outside. Now he stood beside the shepherd holding half a dog biscuit between his fingers. You already gave him one, Sophie reminded him. Noah looked down at Maverick. He looks like he needs another. He always looks like he needs another. Maverick glanced between them with an expression Daniel had learned to interpret perfectly. Sophie laughed. The sound still affected him. Each time Daniel heard his daughter laugh without hesitation, it felt as though another locked room inside their house had opened. The memorial walk began shortly after noon. Families moved along the paved loop while former handlers stopped beside photographs and shared stories. Some dogs walked beside their retired partners. Others existed now only in framed pictures and carefully remembered names. Claire stood for a long moment before the photograph Sophie had chosen. Cole was kneeling beside a younger Maverick, one arm resting across the shepherd's shoulders. Both looked toward the camera with the relaxed confidence of two partners who had no reason to imagine their time together would ever end. Claire touched the edge of the frame. He would have hated this picture. Sophie looked surprised. Why? Because he'd say Maverick looked better than he did. Sophie smiled. Claire looked toward the living dog beside her. But he would have loved today. The first warning came so quietly that few people noticed. A low roll of thunder crossed the distance beyond the trees. Daniel looked toward the western sky. The morning forecast had mentioned scattered storms, nothing unusual for a North Carolina summer. But the clouds beyond the park were darker than he expected, and moving quickly. Ramirez walked over. You seeing that? Yeah. A park volunteer checked the weather app on his phone. Storm cell picked up speed. Within minutes, the temperature seemed to drop. Wind moved sharply through the trees, lifting paper from tables and making the memorial photographs flutter against their clips. Ramirez made the call immediately. "Start moving everyone toward the parking lot and the covered shelter." There was no panic at first. Families gathered bags, handlers shortened leashes, and volunteers began folding lightweight signs. Then, rain began. Large drops struck the pavement. Thunder followed closer this time. Daniel reached for Sophie. "Stay with me." She nodded. Maverick moved automatically beside her. The crowd compressed near the central path as people headed toward the park entrance. Daniel saw Noah looking around. His face changed. "My mom." "She's near the registration tent," Sophie said, but Noah could no longer see it through the moving crowd. "I have to find her." "Noah, stay here," Daniel said firmly. The boy heard his name, but not the instruction clearly over the wind. Then he saw a figure near the far side of the creek and thought it was his mother. He ran. "Noah!" Sophie reacted before Daniel could reach her. She went after him. Maverick followed instantly. Daniel pushed through the crowd, but a heavy branch came down across part of the path between them. It did not strike anyone, but it forced people backward and blocked the most direct route. "Sophie!" Daniel could still see flashes of yellow through the trees. Ramirez appeared beside him. "Where is she?" "Across the path." Noah ran toward the footbridge. Ramirez's face tightened. The creek was already rising from runoff upstream. "Other way," he said. "We circle around the shelter." On the far side of the fallen branch, Sophie reached Noah near the small wooden bridge. "Stop!" Noah was crying now. "I thought I saw my mom." "We'll find her, but Daddy said stay together." A rush of brown rainwater moved faster beneath the bridge than it had minutes earlier. Maverick stepped ahead of them. No command had been given. His posture changed. Sophie recognized it immediately. At home, Maverick was relaxed. He slept in doorways, stole warmth from sunny patches on the floor, and waited patiently whenever Sophie tied yellow ribbons loosely around his collar. This was different. His head rose. His body became balanced and alert. His eyes moved from the bridge to the children and then toward higher ground. Noah tried to step forward. Maverick moved across his path. "Come on," Noah said. Maverick did not move. Sophie looked at the bridge. One of the wooden railings was shaking beneath the wind. "He doesn't want us going that way." Another crack of thunder rolled overhead. Noah reached for Sophie's hand. "What do we do?" Sophie looked at Maverick. For a moment, the old K9 stared toward the covered picnic shelter uphill from the creek. Then he moved several yards in that direction. He stopped, turned, looked back at them. Sophie understood. "Follow him." They moved after Maverick. When Sophie hesitated near a lower section of the path, trying to look back for Daniel, Maverick pressed his shoulder gently against her leg and redirected her uphill. "Okay," she whispered. "I trust you." Maverick moved forward again. He never traveled far, a few yards, then back, a few yards, then back again, to make sure both children were following. The storm had transformed the familiar park into something confusing. Rain blurred the paths, leaves covered signs, and the sound of water made distance difficult to judge. But Maverick seemed to know exactly what mattered: higher ground, shelter, children, together, protection. Daniel and Ramirez reached the opposite trail and stopped. For a second, Daniel could see nothing. Then a bark cut through the storm, one sharp bark. Ramirez froze. Another came from uphill. "That's him." They followed it. Maverick barked again, only after moving several yards, using the sound almost like a marker. Daniel climbed the wet slope. "Sophie! Daddy!" Her voice came from behind the picnic shelter. Daniel rounded the corner and found Sophie and Noah pressed close beneath the covered side of the structure. Maverick stood in front of them. Daniel crossed the final distance in seconds and dropped to one knee, pulling Sophie against him. "You okay?" She nodded. "Noah?" "I'm okay." Ramirez arrived behind them and immediately checked the children. Maverick remained standing until Daniel reached for him. Only then did the shepherd relax. Daniel noticed a small scrape along one front leg, likely from brush or debris on the trail. but Maverick was walking normally. "You're all right, buddy." Maverick leaned briefly into his hand. Minutes later, park staff reported that part of the creek bank near the footbridge had become unstable, and everyone was being kept away until officials could inspect it. Daniel looked toward the direction the children had originally been heading. Then he looked at Maverick. The old shepherd had known. Maybe not exactly what would happen, but enough. He had recognized danger, chosen the safer route, kept two children together, and called others toward them. Ramirez knelt beside Maverick. For several seconds, the veteran K9 sergeant simply studied him. Then he smiled. "There you are." Daniel looked at him. Ramirez ran one hand across Maverick's neck. "That's the dog I remember." Claire arrived with Noah's mother and Dr. Foster moments later. Noah ran to his mother first, then turned around almost immediately. Maverick stood beside Sophie. Noah walked back. This time, he did not hesitate. He wrapped both arms around Maverick's neck. The shepherd remained still, accepting the embrace. "I'm not scared of you anymore," Noah whispered. Claire looked away for a moment, overcome. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Cole didn't lose everything when he died." Daniel understood. Maverick was still carrying something forward, not commands, not trophies, purpose. The following morning, a Jacksonville television station reported the incident in a brief segment about the memorial walk. Retired K9 found alone in park helps lead two children to safety during storm. The reporter called Maverick a hero. Sophie immediately objected. "He was already a hero before we found him." Daniel, sitting beside her on the couch, looked over. "Yeah, he didn't become one yesterday. No, he just got another chance to show people." Daniel watched Maverick sleeping nearby, the old K9 tag resting against his new collar. His phone lay on the coffee table. The deployment decision was still waiting. For weeks, Daniel had treated the choice as a question of courage. Would accepting the assignment prove he was still committed enough? Would turning it down mean he was becoming less of a Marine? But watching Sophie beside Maverick changed the question. His daughter did not need him to prove he could serve far away. She already knew he could leave. What she needed was proof that he could stay. Daniel picked up his phone and called Master Sergeant Rebecca Hayes. "I've made my decision." Rebecca paused. "I'm listening. I want the instructor position at Lejeune." There was no celebration in her response, only the calm certainty Daniel appreciated. "Then I'll start the paperwork." Daniel ended the call. Across the room, Sophie was brushing Maverick's coat. She did not know what he had decided. She also did not know that the permanent adoption paperwork was still folded inside Daniel's jacket. Those were conversations for another day. For now, Daniel knelt beside Maverick and rested a hand against the shepherd's shoulder. Weeks earlier, he had carried an exhausted dog out of this same park because Maverick could barely make the journey himself. Now that dog had led two children to safety. Daniel finally understood. Maverick had never forgotten how to protect. He had never lost what made him a K9. He had only lost the reason to use it. And somehow, against every expectation, he had found that reason again. A month after the storm at Wilson Bay Park, Jacksonville had settled into the steady warmth of late summer. The creek had returned to its banks, the damaged section near the footbridge had been repaired, and the story of the retired K9 who had guided two children to safety had slowly disappeared from the daily news. At the Brooks house, Maverick had recovered from the small scrape on his leg so completely that Sophie sometimes accused him of pretending to be older whenever he wanted an extra biscuit. That Saturday morning, Daniel drove Sophie and Maverick to the Jacksonville Police Department's K9 Memorial Garden. Sophie wore the same yellow dress she had worn the afternoon they found Maverick, though it now sat slightly higher above her knees. Claire Harrison had driven down from Raleigh and was already waiting beside Sergeant Luis Ramirez and Dr. Emily Foster. Noah stood nearby with his mother, holding a rolled sheet of drawing paper under one arm. The gathering was intentionally small. A few current and retired K9 officers stood near the memorial wall, while families moved quietly among photographs and plaques. Ramirez had insisted the morning should not become another public spectacle about Maverick's rescue. To him, the moment belonged just as much to Cole Harrison as it did to the dog standing beside Sophie. Near the center of the garden, a dark cloth covered a new plaque. Ramirez stepped forward. "We spend a lot of time talking about service," he said. "We talk about assignments, years worked, arrests made, searches completed. But anyone who has worked beside a K9 knows the relationship eventually becomes something harder to measure." Claire lowered her eyes. Ramirez removed the cloth. The polished plaque beneath it caught the morning light. "Officer Cole Harrison and K9 Maverick, partners in service, family beyond duty." Sophie read the words slowly. Claire rested one hand against her chest. For a moment she seemed caught between grief and gratitude, but when Maverick moved closer, she smiled. "That sounds like him," she whispered. Ramirez crouched beside Maverick and scratched gently beneath his collar. "You gave us a scare, old man." Maverick leaned into the familiar hand. Then Ramirez stood and held out a small presentation box to Sophie. Inside rested Maverick's retired K9 badge. She looked immediately toward Daniel. "For me?" "For you to keep for him," Ramirez said. "Cole carried the responsibility when Maverick was working. I think you understand what it means now." Sophie held the badge carefully with both hands. "I won't lose it." "I believe you." Daniel had remained unusually quiet throughout the ceremony. Beneath his jacket, his fingers touched something in his pocket that he had been carrying for weeks. When the small crowd began moving toward the shaded tables, he called Sophie back. "There's one more thing." She looked suspiciously pleased. "You've been acting weird all morning." "I'm your father. That's allowed." Daniel knelt beside Maverick and removed the old collar for a moment. The scratched K9 Maverick JPD tag still hung from it, protected now beside the stronger collar they had bought after his recovery. Daniel reached into his pocket. A second metal tag rested in his palm. Sophie leaned closer. One side read simply Maverick. Daniel turned it over. "Brooks family." Sophie stared at the words. For several seconds she did not speak. Then she looked at Daniel. "Does that mean the foster period is over?" Her expression changed instantly. "You adopted him?" Daniel nodded. "Officially." "You already signed?" "Weeks ago." "You kept that secret for weeks?" "I was waiting for today." Sophie dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around Maverick's neck. The shepherd calmly accepted the embrace, tail moving against the grass. "You're staying," she whispered. "You're really staying." Daniel attached the new tag beside the old one. The two pieces of metal touched softly. One represented everything Maverick had been, the other represented where he belonged now. Daniel thought that might have been enough for one morning, but there was another promise he needed to make. "Sophie?" She looked up. "Remember the 8-month assignment?" Her smile faded slightly. "Yes." "I turned it down." Sophie stared at him. Daniel continued before she could misunderstand. "I'm still a Marine. That isn't changing. I accepted the combat training instructor position at Camp Lejeune." "What does that mean?" "It means long days, sometimes. Early mornings. Probably paperwork you'll complain about me reading." She waited. Daniel smiled. "But most nights, I come home." Sophie's eyes filled. "You're staying too?" "I'm staying." She stepped forward and wrapped both arms around him. Daniel closed his eyes. For years, he had believed being a good Marine meant always being ready to go wherever he was needed. He still believed in service. He still believed in duty. But Sophie had taught him something the Corps never could. Sometimes the place where a person was needed most was home. Maverick apparently decided he had been excluded long enough. He pushed his broad head between them until Sophie began laughing. "See?" she said. "He wants a hug too." Daniel rested one hand on Maverick's head. "Of course he does." Across the garden, Claire watched them beside Cole's plaque. She no longer looked guilty. She looked relieved. In the months that followed, what began as one retired K9 story expanded into something larger. Ramirez and the department confirmed the K9 Memorial Walk would return the following year, with the proceeds dedicated to medical care and responsible retirement placements for former police dogs. Dr. Foster volunteered to provide annual wellness examinations for canines, supported by the fund. She said older working dogs had spent enough years taking care of others. Somebody should make sure retirement took care of them. Claire became a familiar visitor at the Brooks home. Sometimes she brought old photographs of Cole. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. Maverick always recognized her car before anyone reached the door. Noah became a regular guest, too. His fear of large dogs faded so completely that he eventually began complaining whenever Sophie got to hold Maverick's leash first. At school, Sophie finally stood before her class for the presentation Mrs. Hannah Kendall had assigned months earlier. On the board behind her were the words, "Someone who makes me brave." Daniel sat in the back of the classroom beside Mrs. Kendall. Noah occupied the front row, holding a drawing he had made in colored pencil. Sophie in a yellow dress, Daniel beside her, and Maverick between them with an exaggeratedly enormous tail. Sophie had originally planned to speak only about Maverick. She changed her mind. "Maverick makes me brave because he doesn't make you prove you aren't scared," she told the class. "He just waits until you're ready." Daniel lowered his eyes. Then Sophie continued. "My dad makes me brave too, not because he's a Marine, because sometimes brave means changing your plan for someone you love." Daniel looked up. Sophie smiled at him. Mrs. Kendall quietly wiped beneath one eye and pretended to adjust her glasses. At Camp Lejeune, Daniel began his instructor assignment. The slower promotion track no longer bothered him as much as he expected. Over time, he also started volunteering with a support program for widowed service members and single military parents. At first, Daniel doubted what he could offer them. Then he realized he did not need perfect answers. He could talk about guilt, about returning to a house that no longer felt the same, about children who became quiet because they were afraid another goodbye was coming, and about learning that being present could be its own form of service. Maverick had not only helped Daniel's family heal. In a quiet way, the old canine had pushed Daniel toward helping other families begin healing too. Ramirez kept one photograph on the wall of the canine unit. It had been taken after the memorial ceremony. Sophie, in her yellow dress, sitting beside Maverick, one hand resting over his new collar. Whenever younger handlers asked why an old retired dog had a place beside photographs of active canines, Ramirez simply told them, "Some dogs finish working long before they finish serving." 1 year after Daniel and Sophie found Maverick, the three of them returned to Wilson Bay Park. The afternoon was warm and bright. Sophie was taller now. The original yellow dress no longer fit, so Claire had helped her find another one, almost the same color. Daniel wore jeans and a gray t-shirt instead of a uniform. He sat on the same bench near the walking path with 2 cups of lemonade, while Sophie threw a tennis ball across the grass. Maverick ran after it. Not quickly. He was still an older German shepherd, and age had earned him the right to take his time. But he ran. His coat shone in the late afternoon sun. His tail was high. He returned with the ball, ignored Daniel completely, and delivered it directly to Sophie. "Traitor!" Daniel called. Sophie laughed. She wrapped her arms around Maverick's neck. For a moment, they stood almost exactly where Daniel remembered finding him a year earlier. Back then, Maverick had barely lifted his head. Now, 2 tags rested against his collar. K9 Maverick, JPD, Brooks family. Daniel looked at them and finally understood something Cole Harrison had known before him. Not everyone who becomes lost needs to be returned to the place they came from. Sometimes the past has already given them everything it can. Sometimes what they need is somewhere new to belong. The sun dropped lower behind the trees. Daniel picked up the empty lemonade cups. "Come on, Soph. Time to go home." Sophie slipped her hand into his. Maverick walked beside her. The 3 of them followed the path toward the parking lot, their shadows stretching together across the pavement in the warm evening light. A Marine who had finally learned how to stay, a little girl who had learned that loving again did not mean forgetting, and an old canine who had spent months wandering until he found the one assignment no badge had ever given him: family. This time, none of them walked home alone. You know what stays with me most about Maverick's story? It wasn't the old canine tag or the yellow dress. It was realizing that Maverick had never lost the heart of a protector. He had only been waiting for someone to give him a reason to believe again. Sophie became that reason. She gave Maverick patience, kindness, and a place beside her without asking him to prove anything. In return, Maverick helped her smile again, gave Noah courage, honored Cole's memory, and showed Daniel that sometimes real strength means choosing to stay. Maybe that was what God wanted Daniel to see in the worn tag marked K9 Maverick, JPD. Daniel thought he was rescuing an old dog, but Maverick was rescuing their family too. He found a home, Sophie found courage, Claire found peace, and Daniel learned that duty also means being there for the people who need you most.
Tonight, I pray God blesses you, protects your family, heals the wounds you carry quietly, and gives you the heart to recognize someone who may simply be waiting for one more chance. If Maverick's story touched you, write Amen in the comments. And if you believe in loyalty, faith, family, and second chances, subscribe and stay with us. But Maverick was not the last retired canine to appear where no one expected him. Wait until I tell you about the former Marine who found an aging German Shepherd sitting alone beside an abandoned ranger station during the first snow of winter. Around the dog's neck was an old police badge, and every evening he returned to the same locked door as if he were still waiting for someone who had disappeared years earlier. When the Marine finally discovered whose name was written inside that badge case and why the canine refused to leave that mountain, the truth changed an entire family. Subscribe now, because the next story is one you will not want to miss.